Welcome to Module 7. As always, we're going to go ahead and get started with a short meditation. So go ahead and get comfortable and in a good position for breathing and relaxation.
Go ahead and find a spot that's comfortable for you to meditate in. And begin to relax your shoulders away from your ears. Let the tension in your forehead and jaw release, and begin to draw the eyes down or to a close. Taking the next few moments to tap into your breath. Just noticing its qualities in this moment. And then consciously shifting it just slightly to soften and lengthen, flowing in and out of the nose. Go ahead and place one hand over your heart center and begin to breathe in and out from this space, generating feelings of warmth. I invite you to think about something that you are struggling with, or perhaps you've been beating yourself up about it. Something that doesn't feel great for you. And just bring that into your heart center and begin to give it a little bit of compassion, releasing judgment. And recognize that it is okay to have these feelings. It is okay if you're having a hard time. And it's really important to honor these feelings when they arise for you. But instead of letting yourself get swept away by this feeling or emotion, I invite you to try and be the observer of this feeling or emotion. Because these emotions will inevitably change, they will pass, they will become something different. It's okay to have these feelings. It's important to honor them and recognize them. So offer yourself some kindness and love today. Offer yourself compassion in this moment. And accept and release what is no longer serving you. Just for today, I let go of anger. Just for today, I let go of worry. Just for today, I am grateful for my many blessings. Just for today, I do my work honestly. Just for today, I am kind to all living things. That was the Reiki prayer to bring in some good love and energy into your day and to take with you as you gently come back into the space. And blink your eyes open as you're ready.
I like that at the end. Just for today, I'm going to be kind to all living things. Just a reminder to be kind to yourself. A recap from our last module. Eating without distraction, doing away with food rules, those are all ways to increase our interoceptive awareness or our attunement. And also, as we learned, to really tune into satisfaction. You will gain more satisfaction from your meals if you eat when you are not too full and not too hungry, maybe somewhere around that 3 or 4 on the hunger scale. So maybe you're starting to notice that now, that when you are nice and hungry, but not overly hungry, food actually tastes better. As always, our important reminders are that intuitive eating is not a diet. Intuitive eating is not rigid. There are no rules with intuitive eating. And self-care and self-compassion are cornerstones of intuitive eating. Let's talk a little bit about interoceptive awareness again and do a quick review. Interoceptive awareness was a big part of the following principles that we've already gone through: honor your hunger, feel your fullness, and find satisfaction in your foods. How are you doing in this area? Are you starting to get better at that whole body attunement, that interoceptive awareness? This picture of my son really cracks me up. At a baseball game, he ordered a hot dog, but he realized he just wasn't really into it. After sitting down to watch the game, he must have been asking himself, am I hungry? And then he realized, no. Am I still feeling full from an earlier snack or meal? Maybe he realized yes. And then, am I finding satisfaction in this hot dog in the moment? And he realized no. Now, as kids, they might not even realize that they're asking these questions. It's not something that they even think much of. It's just an automatic response. If they're not enjoying a food, they're not going to eat it. If they're not physically hungry, they're not going to want to eat food. I noticed his body language and told him, Cameron, if you aren't hungry right now, you can save the hot dog for later. And of course, that's what he did. He put it down and ate it about 30 minutes later. I understand it was probably cold by then, but with some ketchup and mustard, he was good to go. And honestly, if he wouldn't have eaten it, it would have been okay. It's not the end of the world. I would have hoped that he would learn that he can always wait to order food until when he's hungry, wait for that moment of hunger to approach to order food. He didn't need to order it at that moment. So maybe he learned from that experience. Kids are also just really good at feeling hunger and fullness cues and not eating things that aren't satisfying to them. So they're really, really good at that. Okay, let's talk about mantras from the last time. Our mantra might have been before your meals, ask, what do I want? And maybe after your meals, ask, how do I feel? And am I truly satisfied? So really looking for that point or waiting for that point in your meal when food just isn't tasting good anymore. And then asking yourself, how do I feel physically? Am I noticing fullness? Am I truly satisfied in this moment? Am I still enjoying the food that I'm eating? So at the end of the last module, I suggested asking yourself these questions before and after your meals. And I want to know, how did it go? Were you able to consider what you actually wanted to eat before making a decision? Was it liberating to make a decision based on satisfaction and desire instead of a diet rule or a belief? Something else I asked you was to write a letter to yourself, or actually to your last meal. Were you able to write that letter to your last meal or to any meal? Did you notice anything from doing this activity? Would you have chosen that same meal again, that same food, those same hunger and fullness cues, or that same hunger and fullness level when you started that meal? How could that meal have given you more satisfaction? What could you have done to that meal to make it even better and more satisfying? What about your milestone charts? Have you been able to try more of your fear foods or those foods that you love but you tend to restrict? Are you starting to notice habituation yet? As a reminder, you'll notice habituation when you do continuously give yourself unconditional permission to eat those foods that you once restricted. How about your discovery skills? How are you doing with that hunger and fullness discovery? Are you learning some things about yourself, about what it feels like to be hungry and full? What about satisfaction? I know that was one we started at the last module. Have you learned anything about what truly satisfies you? All right, let's go ahead and start with the next principle: cope with your emotions with kindness. Just a quick note, in your book, the principle is titled Cope with Your Emotions Without Using Food. It has since been updated, but we're going to use this new name. Coping with your emotions with kindness certainly has a more positive ring to it. And the idea is not to assume that you should never use food to handle emotions or never eat because of a certain feeling or emotion, but instead find other things that you can use as well as tools. After all, using food to cope with emotions is a part of our lives. Birthday celebrations, maybe at the loss of a loved one. So many of life's ups and downs are presented with food, and that's okay. When you are distracted by the hustle, we lose access to language that describes our emotional world, and we adopt the language of food and fat. Our body becomes the scapegoat. Instead of recognizing our anger, we direct that anger towards our body. And this is a direct quote from the book Reclaiming Trust or Reclaiming Body Trust, which I did also put in your resources page. I think this quote says so much, and I want to ask if you relate to this. Do you ever find yourself having greater body image struggles or thinking more negatively about yourself or your food choices during times of stress? Instead of sitting with our emotions and our feelings, we often use our body as a scapegoat. Instead of getting comfortable with our emotions and certain feelings, we push them away and mask them by focusing on something else, often our body, and sometimes it's food. What you eat is less important than why you eat. And this is a quote from the book Body Respect, which is also in your resources handout. I think it's such a meaningful quote, and I truly couldn't agree with this more. As a dietitian, of course, I agree that what we eat is generally important. But today, we're going to dive into the idea of why we eat. On this journey, you've learned to eat when hungry, eat for satisfaction, eat for pleasure, and eat for nourishment. But what about eating to handle certain feelings and emotions? Let's talk about the key concepts for today's module. Emotional eating, what is it? And what is self-care's role? The deprivation quotient? Are you vulnerable? And last, healing emotional eating. Let's first talk about the difference between emotions and feelings. Emotions are psychological responses to events and situations. They may be triggered by an event, person, place, memory, or anything that stimulates the five senses. Common emotions include joy, sadness, fear, excitement, disgust, and surprise. Feelings can be emotional or physical. In other words, they might sound like, I feel cold. They often represent the way people experience certain emotions. Feelings tend to originate from the mind or thinking. I just want to make a note that I may tend to use these words interchangeably in this module because here's the thing. We may use food to cope with a strong emotion or a strong feeling. And the tips and strategies for this type of eating are all the same. We all eat in response to emotions at times. Eating in response to emotions or feelings is perfectly normal. Raise your hand if you've ever eaten because of joy, sadness, fear, boredom. All hands, I would assume, are raised. Right after we're born, we learn to associate food, our formula or breast milk, with pleasure and coping with emotions. When we cry as infants, we were fed, even if the cry wasn't because of hunger, but because the dog scared the baby. When we were scared or sad, we were fed or offered a comforting snack. When we had a diaper that needed change, we were given a dry diaper, then fed for more soothing pleasure. We come out of the womb and are right away taught to associate food with pleasure, comfort, and emotional healing. As we move through life, we start learning different ways to cope with emotions outside of just food. And studies have shown that dieters have increased risk of using food to cope with their emotions and feelings. I think I've talked about this before. This makes sense. Deprivation, as I've said, will make food more rewarding. For many of us, finding other tools to cope hasn't happened yet. Or maybe those tools worked at one time, but now food is the best way to feel comfort from an emotion. If food is your main way to cope at this moment, that's okay. Finding other tools won't happen overnight, and maybe you're not even ready to find other tools. Remember, this is a journey, and I want you to take this journey at your own pace. So what exactly is emotional eating? In previous modules, we talked about different types of hunger. There's biological hunger or physical hunger, which you've worked on getting more in touch with throughout the past several modules. There's primal hunger, which is that rebound hunger that takes over when you've ignored your biological physical hunger. And then there's practical hunger, which is hunger that isn't necessarily physically or biologically driven, but instead it's practically driven. Maybe you eat when you're sick because you know you need to get some nourishment. Or maybe you eat before going into a long meeting, even though you're not hungry because you know you're not going to be eating for a long time. What about emotional hunger or emotional eating? Emotional eating happens when you're biologically or physically hungry, but also when you may not be biologically hungry. Emotional eating may be triggered by a feeling or emotion such as boredom, anger, excitement, really anything but physical hunger. Generally speaking, food should be consumed to mitigate hunger and nourish your body. But the thing is, emotional hunger or emotional eating is something we all experience, and there is a spectrum. It's when you find you're eating emotionally as a main way to cope or handle those unmet needs and strong emotions, and not just to nourish your body and mitigate hunger. It's a sign that maybe some work should be done, or can be done, I should say. Maybe it's time to talk with someone, seek out the help of a counselor, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. Let's talk about the spectrum of emotional eating. Let's start on the far left with sensory gratification. It's the most common way to use food for pleasure and sensory gratification. This is a critical part of being an intuitive eater, allowing yourself pleasure and gratification from food. In the module on honoring your hunger, we talked about taste hunger, which is when you may not be hungry, but something just sounds good or looks good and you want it. Intuitive eaters will eat that food, find gratification, and remain in tune with their fullness cues. Next, moving over a little bit to the right on the spectrum is comfort. Using food for comfort is a reasonable way to use food at times, especially when you're sick or wanting to evoke some type of childhood memories. For example, when you're at the local fair and smell those corn dogs you loved as a kid and you order one, even though you aren't necessarily hungry, they just bring back fond memories. And intuitive eaters enjoy food for comfort at times while also staying in touch with their fullness and without guilt. Continuing on the spectrum is distraction. A little further down on this spectrum is of emotional eating is distraction, where you may use food to distract you from the feelings you don't want to feel or experience. Some examples of this may be eating a bag of chips to distract you from work you have piling up, or eating to distract from the anxiety of preparing for a big meeting. On occasion, this is absolutely normal. But if you find you're doing this often, and especially with guilt and without staying in touch with hunger and fullness, this may be a sign you need to seek help or reevaluate self-care. This may be a good time to ask, what unmet need am I trying to meet with food? Is food helping? What else could I do instead to meet that unmet need? Food may be the answer sometimes, but exploring other avenues is, of course, a good idea. Continuing on further down the spectrum is sedation. Sedation is using food as a numbing tool. This is often to numb painful emotions that may be lingering and long-term. If you find you're using food to numb the pain of a trauma or other life event, seek help from a licensed counselor who can help you. This is especially important if you're doing this often. And then last, punishment. When eating for sedation becomes so frequent and intense, food guilt may start to build to the point of using food in a forceful and punitive way. There's no pleasure in eating this way. And along with self-compassion, seeking the help of a counselor would be a great idea if you find yourself using food as a way to punish. Now that you understand the spectrum of emotional eating, let's talk about different emotional triggers for eating. Boredom, believe it or not, is the most common trigger for emotional eating. I want to ask, do you resonate with that? I know I do. This is a good time to think about the different emotional triggers that you have for eating and when they started. Is it anxiety, emptiness, loneliness, boredom, depression, sadness, love, joy? Go ahead and take a look at page 161 for a full list. If you can fulfill yourself with self-care, nourishment, nurturance, self-compassion, food will no longer be a way to deal with emotions. And that's a direct quote from Intuitive Eating Edition 4. At this time, consider once again reviewing the self-care assessment on page 41. How are you doing? 4 important basic self-care components are sleep, aiming for 7 to 8 hours a night, life balance, learning to say no and not feeling bad about it, putting yourself first, nourishment, feeding yourself every 4 to 5 hours, no matter what, even if you don't feel hungry, reminding yourself that if it's been 5 hours, I should probably eat something to stay nourished. Stress, finding ways to handle life's everyday stressors, such as exercise, mindful movement. We'll talk about that in a couple modules from now. Meditation, yoga, deep breathing, talking to a therapist or counselor. Let's also not forget the importance of even more basic needs: the need for sensual pleasure, expressing your feelings, being heard and understood, being intellectually stimulated, receiving comfort and warmth. Thinking about these, is there anything lacking in your life currently? How good self-care practices can help. When you take care of yourself, your reward centers aren't as sensitive to things like food or other things you may use to cope. When your self-care practices are in check, you are less prone to emotional ups and downs. When your self-care practices are in check, you're better able to handle the emotional ups and downs you experience. I want to revisit a slide from Module 4. Certain beliefs, whether they're about food or your body or body image or anything, can cause certain feelings or emotions, and then those feelings or emotions can cause certain consequences or behaviors. Back in Module 4, we talked about the importance of questioning those thoughts or beliefs. We called them cognitive distortions, and asking yourself if, in fact, they're actually true. This may be a good first step in not letting those thoughts bloom into something bigger. Have you started working on that yet? Good self-care practices can help you along this spectrum, as it can help you handle your cognitive distortions, or it can help you be prepared to handle strong emotions. Remember, nourishing your body with plenty of food that is filling and satisfying throughout your day is an important part of self-care. So take a look at this spectrum and see where self-care comes into play. I might even argue that self-care would come into play when it comes to the behavior. But if you have good self-care practices, that can help you handle those cognitive distortions, and it can also help you with those emotional ups and downs. What about the deprivation quotient? Part of coping with emotions with kindness is remembering that diets are not serving you. Foods are almost always more rewarding when we lack self-care, but also when we restrict them and have rules around them. So what this means is when we are stealthily deprived of food, and then we cope with our emotions using food, the reward signals in our brain get fired up, and that perpetuates the cycle of eating to cope. To find out whether you still have some lingering self-deprivation, fill out the questions on page 158. You may be thinking you've given yourself unconditional permission to eat, but if you still at times have conditions around your eating, consider this as an important thing to continue working on if you want to start handling your emotions without food and instead with kindness and self-care. When emotions are heightened and we are still stealthily deprived, we are more likely to use food to cope because food is more rewarding when we are deprived of it. So do you still have lingering diet mentality? Perhaps do you have stealth deprivation? Are you stealthily deprived? In other words, you might not realize it, but you're not giving yourself that full permission to eat all foods. I want you to go ahead and pause and evaluate your deprivation quotient on page 158. Eating to cope has its place, as I've already mentioned. Using food to cope with feelings and emotions is a normal and natural part of life. Go ahead and pause and fill out pages 159 to 160 on the pros and cons of emotional eating. When food becomes your only tool for coping, or you use it to numb or punish, you may want to seek help from a counselor. After looking at the pros and cons of your emotional eating, check to see whether your cons outweigh your pros of emotional eating. If they do, You are ready to continue this module and learn some coping mechanisms. Chances are you've already started some good coping mechanisms over the past several modules. Can you think of some that have served you well recently when you've been dealing with specific emotions? If your pros of emotional eating outweigh your cons, you may not be ready to work towards healing, but it doesn't mean you never will be. You may just need some more personal one-on-one guidance. This may be the time to reach out to a counselor or set up an introductory call with me if you'd like. The information can be found on my website. I want you to know that seeing a counselor is good for anyone, but especially if through this course, you've realized you have some unmet needs or traumas you need to work through. Identifying emotional triggers, I want you to go ahead and pause and fill out page 165, Coping with Feelings. The more check marks you have, the more likely you are using food to cope. Please know there is nothing wrong with you if you have a lot of check marks on this worksheet. You now know some things you can do to make food less rewarding. Evaluate your deprivation quotient and evaluate your self-care practices. So those are some things you can continue working on as you continue your intuitive eating and wellness journey. Now, let's talk about healing emotional eating. We've already mentioned this, self-care, right? Everyone experiences strong emotions from time to time, but a lack in self-care will make you more vulnerable to those strong emotions, while also negatively affecting whole body attunement. So I didn't mention this before, but not only does a lack of self-care cause more emotional ups and downs, and it makes it more difficult to handle those, but a lack in self-care will also affect your whole body attunement, or your ability to notice hunger and fullness and the various other signals that your body gives you. A lack in self-care not only exacerbates your emotions, but makes you more vulnerable to eating emotionally. So please, if you haven't yet, or if you want to after this module, go ahead and review that self-care assessment on pages 41 to 43. And just as important as self-care is self-nurturance and self-compassion. Self-criticism is strongly associated with depression and a dislike for life in general. This is just a reminder to be gentle with yourself. Be curious instead of judgmental, and give yourself, I don't know, maybe a nice warm hug every day. Come from a place of curiosity, not judgment. This picture of my daughter, Paige, is the perfect image of curiosity. She is so curious about what I'm offering her. She's not judging what's on the spoon. She's thinking about it, contemplating it. She's curious whether she wants to try it or not. She's curious and not judgmental. It is my hope that you approach life with the same curiosity and no longer pass judgment on yourself. Let's talk about building emotional muscles, learning to sit with and really feel your emotions and feelings instead of immediately using food or something else to cope. Use curiosity instead of judgment if you ultimately do use food. So we're going to work through this idea of sitting with your emotions and your feelings, truly building that emotional muscle. And then the reminder that if you still choose food, even after sitting with your emotions, that's okay. We can't heal what we can't feel. Have you ever stopped in the middle of a strong emotion and actually felt it? Have you ever stopped in the middle of a strong feeling and actually felt it? So have you ever stopped in the middle of a negative feeling and actually questioned, where is it coming from? As part of your self-study work between now and the next module, you're going to fill out the worksheet about paying attention to your body's reaction and physical feelings and sensations that relate to specific emotions and feelings. This is not easy, especially if you've been pushing your feelings and emotions away for a long time, as many of us have. But it's an important step to learning to heal and react with emotions with kindness. In the book, Reclaiming Body Trust, which is listed in your resources page, there was a helpful quote. What would I be sitting with if I wasn't preoccupied with food or my body right now? Now that you've become more aware of your body's signals for nourishment, fullness, this question may come more easily to you. If you're eating emotionally, identify it. Ask yourself, what unmet need do I have right now that I'm trying to meet with food or by using my body as a scapegoat if you're having negative body talk and dialogue? Just like many areas of intuitive eating, just being more aware of this question and being aware of your thoughts and your actions is a great place to start. Next is the voices section of this module. Sumner Brooks is the author of the book, How to Raise an Intuitive Eater, listed in your resources sheet. Sumner was interviewed on my podcast, Nutrition Unmeasured, which at the time was the Dietitian's Dish podcast back in September of 22, where she talked about letting go of alcohol, which was her way of coping with emotions for a long time. This clip is just a 2-minute clip of that episode where she shares how she found that sitting with her emotions and her feelings was the best way to get comfortable with them, and therefore her best tool for discontinuing her automatic habit of using alcohol to cope. Just like some people use food to cope, others use drugs, alcohol, or other harmful tools or substances to cope. But the healing can often look the same. There are a lot of parallels, and I really appreciate Sumner's vulnerability in this clip. Take a listen.
In a recent Instagram post, Sumner, you said, a quote, you said, sometimes self-care is just being in the pain of reality instead of trying to avoid, distract, or numb. Build that slowly like an emotional muscle. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that a huge part of my sobriety journey has been I like to think of it as an emotional muscle, but basically building the tolerance to feel emotions as they come up, particularly uncomfortable emotions, and letting them land and not feeling like I need to react or erase them or fix them or run from them. Personally, I feel like this is one of the superpowers that you get from sobriety is because of the work that it takes to stop the behavior of numbing or distracting. You end up building a different tolerance for uncomfortable emotions. And let's just face it, life doesn't feel good a lot of the times. We've got great moments and really happy feelings, and then we have really unpleasant, difficult feelings. And I think anybody who's interested in living a sober life might relate to struggling with that. Gosh, what do we do if we can't escape this feeling? And the last couple of years, I have had so many moments where I would just turn to my husband and say, oh my God, right now is that moment when I would go pour a glass of wine or a glass of whiskey, just literally to get out of my head or to stop thinking about this or to not feel this. So it became really, really clear to me that when I would be in the most uncomfortable of my emotions, I was always running. I was never allowing them to land. And then I also wasn't giving myself the opportunity to deal with whatever the problem was. And that, I think, is really what leads you into kind of this terrible cycle in alcohol use disorder, which is you have a negative feeling, you avoid, distract, or numb it, and then you never really get to the root of the problem. And so it's sort of like a recurring cycle. And when you get out of that cycle and kind of get off of that carousel, you build a lot of skills and a lot of coping techniques that are truly life-changing, in my opinion.
All right. Hopefully you enjoyed that clip with Sumner. And I just really appreciated her openness and vulnerability there. And honestly, the parallels between using alcohol to cope, using food to cope, using anything to cope, it's just the whole idea is that we're not sitting with and getting to the bottom of those feelings and emotions. Instead, we're numbing them and pushing them away. So the idea here is to try to work through those and get away from constantly numbing and pushing those feelings away. And she just said that so well. All right, let's talk about taking a time out. When you find yourself heading towards food, remember to halt. And what this means and what this stands for, this acronym is ask, am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I lonely? Or am I tired? So essentially, am I actually physically hungry or am I dealing with another emotion or feeling? It's important to learn to notice and feel your emotions and then just take a time out. Ask what you're feeling. What unmet need do you have? What do you need in order to handle that unmet need? As you build your emotional muscle and get more practice in sitting with your feelings and emotions, it's good to start considering what you need in order to handle those emotions or any unmet need that you have. You may find that you do indeed want food in this moment to heal, and that's okay. But over time, you can work on finding other tools that are more effective than food. What might those look like? This is actually from my Instagram and just gives you some ideas of what you can do instead of eating when you are handling a strong emotion. Read a book, go for a walk, listen to some good music, take a bath, or call a friend or go out with a friend. Some other ideas might be taking some deep breaths, meeting with a counselor, a change of scenery, getting outside in some fresh air, writing a journal, or writing a letter to yourself. All right, some further learning, if you're interested in learning more about this area, Practicing Mindfulness, a book that I put in your resources page. Of course, I'm always going to put the Body Kindness book in there as well in this further learning slide. Self-Compassion by Kristen Neff, just the importance of that positive self-talk. And then I did also put a list of counselors in your area in that resources page. I also want you to tune into some good podcasts if you're interested in learning more about emotional eating. Episode 234 of the Find Your Food Voice podcast, I Want to Stop Emotionally Eating, using intuitive eating and the food police or the food peace framework to compassionately explore food cravings. Find Your Food Voice, episode 153. I've made peace with food, yet I still eat emotionally. Why? And now to the assignments. Getting to know your body, the physical sensations of emotions, page 164. Learning to sit with your feelings, 169 to 171. And then last, I really want you to pull out that pro-con list from module 3 and ask yourself if there's anything else you can add to it. Intentions, to remember this HALT acronym. Am I hungry? Am I maybe feeling some type of an emotion or feeling? Am I angry, lonely, or tired? Use this the next time you find yourself going for a snack or walking toward the kitchen. Am I actually physically hungry? Or am I feeling an emotion or a feeling? Remember to ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? And what do I need right now? Listen, if you ultimately decide I need food right now, give yourself permission, and that's okay. I hope you enjoyed this module and remember to reach out to me at any time for questions or comments.